From the European Parliament in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thanks for joining us. This is what we have on the program. Turkey offensive, how military action in northern Syria could affect migration to Europe. White House boycott, a looming constitutional crisis over the impeachment inquiry of Donald Trump. Italy downsized. The government pushes for a smaller legislature, but is the motivation fiscal or political? Deepfake fears, convincing and terrifying. What you need to know about a new political weapon. And rebellion standouts. Climate change protesters attract attention in tonight's Raw Moment. It's time to meet our panelists this evening. We have, of course, Darren McCaffrey, our political editor at Euronews. Darren, what are you watching today?
I think it is downsizing parliaments. Do we need fewer politicians, fewer people like these? Well, we'd certainly have fewer guests,
what do you think?
wouldn't we?
That would be
the big thing is, though, when we look at our politics, which is in trouble, you think maybe we need possibly more politicians try and help solve those problems.
All right, we'll be talking about that. And joining us tonight as well, Roberto Metsola, a Maltese MEP with the European People's Party. What about
politician,
you,
yes.
Roberto?
I'm going to answer exactly what Darren just said. I think that's a discussion we should have from a general perspective, but also what's happening, of course, in the United States, and with the latest statement of Erdogan, we'll have to really go into that, I think, today.
In Syria. All right. And also with us, Jeffrey Van Orden, a British MEP with the European Conservatives and Reformists group. What about you, Jeffrey?
Well, we've tried to reduce the size of the House of Commons, but we do need good men and women of integrity in politics, and we need more people like that. So let's not dismiss all politicians out of hand. Some of us try to do a good job.
All right, you're watching that story, but we will begin this evening in Syria because Turkish forces have begun an assault on northern Syria, according to Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. It's left Europe worrying for its security as warnings of a potential resurgence of ISIS and the fate of thousands of detainees held in the region pour in. The military reinforcements had been bolstered on either side of the border in the run-up to the offensive. Kurdish authorities have declared a state of emergency and sent out a mobilization call to civilians to head to the front line. It comes as President Trump announced a withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria at the weekend. Now, before we get the view from Turkey, let's take a look at exactly which area we are talking about. So you have the Turkish-Syrian border, which is largely controlled by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces there. Turkey's military operation is aimed at removing Kurdish militants, which it sees as terrorists, from the area in order to create a 20-mile safe zone for millions of Syrian refugees. So you can see a corridor on that graphic. Now, within that area, major Kurdish towns and several detention centers for former ISIS fighters. So they're located there. So now let's go to Turkey and in Istanbul, where journalist Ayla Jean Yakli is standing by for us. President Erdogan had said that operations had already started. Can you bring us the latest and what conversations are taking place there in Turkey as this is unfolding?
This is very much unfolding. It's all taken place within the last hour or so when Turkish jets apparently launched airstrikes on a Syrian Kurdish town right across the border from Turkey's southern Şanlıurfa province. And now we've just gotten reports that there's also shelling taking place. Turkish forces are firing howitzers at a second Syrian Kurdish town. So this is all just happening within the last hour or so.
Okay, so what kind of conversation is taking place there? Because you have Turkey, Erdogan seemed to be very confident about the kind of security they can provide, with the threat of resurgence of ISIS. They're saying, okay, we're confident, but, is this a severe miscalculation on Turkey's part when it comes to that?
Well, the Turkish government is quite confident that this is something that it can see through. It's the third incursion that it's launched into Syria since 2016. And so it is citing those previous incursions over the last 3 years as a sign of its likelihood of achieving success. This is very different, though, from those two previous offensives into Syria. This is the heart of the Kurdish-controlled territory in northeastern Syria. This is essentially their homeland. And so Turkey can expect to see greater resistance. However, it is an unmatched two sides in this battle. You have Turkey, which is NATO's second largest force, battling an irregular militia that has received arms and training from the U.S. in the fight against Islamic State. But it's hard to see it as offering a true obstacle in Turkey's way. And you mentioned also the Islamic State fighters that are here. There's something like 10,000 or more Islamic State militants or their family members who are currently being held in this area. And Turkey has said that it will take on essentially interning them now from the SDF, the Kurdish-led militia. But that's something that we're going to have to wait and see how that part of this equation will take place.
All right. And what about Trump's threats to, quote unquote, obliterate Turkey's economy? This seems to have just been ignored completely at this point.
At this point, yes. I mean, he did say that on Monday, but just a few hours after greenlighting this incursion by Turkey. So at the very least, he's sending mixed messages. After saying that, after issuing that threat, he turned around and invited President Erdogan to come to Washington, D.C. next month. So it doesn't at this stage seem like a real threat, but we'll see. It's hard to know what kinds of concessions he sought, if any, from Erdogan as he undertakes this incursion. But he is under a lot of pressure in the United States, especially from his own party, to not abandon the Kurds, who have been allies of the United States in the fight against Islamic State. It's important to point out that Turkey has a far longer and deeper alliance with the United States as two members of NATO. And so that we've got the United States essentially perhaps trying to please two sides, and that might be an impossible task.
All right, thank you for that. Ayla Jean Yakli, a journalist in Turkey there. All right, let's start with a reaction to, what just unfolded in the last few hours. This incursion into Syria, how dangerous is this and a big of a threat to the EU?
No, I think, first of all, we need to talk about it, and we need to be discussing our reaction as a union when something like this happens so close to us. I also heard what was just said, that you have phone calls by a president of the United States with the leader of another country that influences such a catastrophic chain of events that could have such a debilitating effect on the region. I mean, we have a situation, as Hillary Clinton said, that this would be a betrayal to the allies of the United States and the rest of the world in the fight against ISIS. You have pocket cells of the Islamic State that could now be given new energy or space to start to act again. So what has essentially been a period of putting, let's say, a lot of strength on a threat in a region is now open again. So that is very concerning to all of us.
Would this essentially mean, Jeffrey, that this, as some would suggest, a complete backtrack, or at least would undo a lot of the progress by NATO and US troops in the region?
Well, not necessarily. I think we need to be more understanding of Turkey's concerns. I mean, there's a country, it is a NATO member. It is a country which has suffered terrorism over many, many years. It's a country which is very concerned about Kurdish formations, if you like, that might take on a state-like nature, which would indeed then threaten the integrity of the Turkish state. But most importantly, in the last few years, Turkey has taken millions of refugees from the Syrian conflict, millions of them. I visited Gaziantep. I actually visited Aleppo just before the conflict started. I know that area a little bit. I think we need to understand Turkey's concerns. It's too easy just to stereotype Turkey and have a sort of gut reaction to whatever happens.
But it's also fair to say that Turkey's approach to Kurdish concerns hasn't necessarily always been exemplary.
Well, you're quite right, but I mean, this has gone up and down now. I mean, there was a period when, if you remember, with Erdogan in his early days, that there was an acceptance of Kurdish language could be taught in schools, that there was a greater recognition of Kurdish cultural interests and all of that. And then terrorism started again, and things took a backtrack. So, this is up and down over the years.
It did unfold really quickly. Darren?
Yeah, it has unfolded quite quickly in a matter of days.
Yeah.
But of course, this has been a concern for some of the international community for many months, considering that President Trump first mooted this way back at the end of last year. The point is, I think there's very few people in the international community who do want this to happen, despite what Jeffrey would say is the concerns of the Turkish. Many clearly within the Trump administration and indeed across Congress don't want it to happen. The French certainly don't want it to happen, given their concerns about the rise of the Islamic State. The Russians are concerned too, because, of course, they're involved very heavily in Syria with the Assad regime. So for a whole lots of reasons, not least of all because it's going to add further instability to a rather unstable part of the world.
Right.
Is this really what that part of the world needs? Even with
the
Turkey's concerns, and this is the problem with this. You've got Turkey, which is a NATO member, and then you've also got the Kurds, who've been allies of many Western democracies in the fight against the Islamic State.
What is Europe to do with all these warnings? It seems like everyone had been sounding the alarm, even just yesterday. What is the EU to do? Not beyond a statement. You know?
Well, yeah, I'm always one to advocate for a more in-depth debate. I mean, we cannot simply sit idly by why these things happen so close to us.
But isn't that what a debate is? A debate is sitting idly by and talking about it happening.
A lot of times in this building, we prefer not to do anything, and that has been quite concerning in the past. But on this, I think we need to have a broader perspective and say, look, you can have world leaders who get together on a phone call, and the chain of events that happens because of that phone call, where you have people, as you have just said, across the political spectrum in the US, which call this a betrayal, that call this a setback.
Can the EU be united on this topic, though?
Well, I think we should be united on knowing, first of all, what's happening, and secondly, as we have just heard, what's the consequences of what Turkey is doing, and how a president of the United States that would say, look, I've just had a phone call and this is what's going to happen, and then threatening to obliterate Turkey and then withdrawing it.
We're running out of time. I'll give you a quick reaction. Can the EU be united in a response to this, you think?
Well, I don't know about the EU in this. The EU has a great interest in migration policy with Turkey. It is said it won't be funding any safe zone, but the EU as such is not necessarily the critical player.
Can I just very quickly add, which is essentially, and this is the problem for the European Union, that when it comes down to it, it has got such little clout, because in lots of cases, it's very unwilling to act.
Okay, so this has just, it's still the beginning. It's starting, so we'll definitely be watching this closely. Let's turn to the UK now, where the Brexit deadline is fast approaching, but talks between the two sides seem to have hit a wall, as another extension seems increasingly likely. Well, let's get more on this from our correspondent, Vincent McAviney, who is joining us from London. So, Vincent, at this point, is there any hope at all of getting a deal?
Well, Boris Johnson has put out a video message on Twitter this afternoon, Tessa, saying that he is doing lots of things this week, including continuing to work on this deal. But it is a bit of a communication strategy from number 10 Downing Street, trying to purposefully confuse things, to muddle everyone. We've had leaks coming out from sources. We've had briefings coming out from spokespeople with different messages. They've been blaming Brussels, blaming Berlin, blaming Dublin, saying that they think that it's all gone down and it's now impossible, but they're still saying they're working. And we know that in the next 24 hours, the Prime Minister will be meeting with the Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, somewhere in the UK, we believe, to try to go through this, because, as has been the case for over the past year, Northern Ireland is still the sticking point in all of this. But many people think this is all part of Boris Johnson's strategy to look like he's trying to get a deal, and he's not even confirmed yet that he'll go to the EU Council meeting next Thursday. So it remains to be seen whether he's serious about this, or it is all part of a game leading up to that inevitable general election.
There is that Ben Act, which we've been talking about the last few days, which essentially forces Mr. Johnson to seek that extension from the EU. But there's always the question, will he or won't he ignore the law? So can he ignore it?
Well, it is the law of the land. It was passed by that place, Parliament. It went to the Queen and she signed it. The leak that came out on Monday night from someone in Downing Street still said they thought that there were ways of getting around it. But there has been a case in the Scottish courts today where they tried to get an order, Joanna Cherry MP and others tried to get an order put on the Prime Minister to make sure that he sent that letter on the 19th of October. They have said at the moment they will take the Prime Minister on his word, which his lawyers have put to the court saying he will follow the law. But but they've said on the 21st of October, if the Prime Minister has passed that deadline and not done it, they will reconsider it then. That could lead to a legal fight which goes all the way back up to the Supreme Court, just over the other side of Parliament here. But there's, of course, very little time then with that October 31st deadline. The one big thing we do know is that Parliament, for only the 5th time since 1939, will sit on a week on Saturday. It doesn't do Saturday sittings. The last time it did one was when the Falkland Islands were invaded. So that is the day that the Prime Minister is meant to send that letter, and MPs will be able to really hold him to account on that day to make sure that if there is no deal, he will get that letter off and there will be an extension, or they could try and pull some other manoeuvres, possibly try and revoke Article 50 if they get a free vote on what to do, or we could see them finally bringing that vote of no confidence. So it's going to be a critical few days here in London.
Thanks for that, Vincent McAviney there. You know, the MEPs that we've had here so far, when I asked the question, will Boris Johnson break the law? They're like, surely he's not going to break the law. What do you think? Is he going to do that?
I'm not going to focus on whether or not he's going to break the law. I'm more focused on whether or not there's going to be a deal. I've just come out of the debating chamber of the European Parliament, where we've had Juncker and Barnier both speaking. Some people focus on the negative things they said. I focus on the positive things they've said.
Well,
yes,
I'll give the negative, and you can give the positive, Jeffrey.
Right.
Michel Barnier said to put things very frankly and to try to be objective at this particular point, which is what, a week away from the Council. We're not really in a position where we're going to be able to find an agreement. Time is pressing. That sounds to me. At the end of the day, don't forget, they are not negotiating. What we've seen over the last few weeks is the European Union asking Britain to clarify its position.
Right.
They have not even entered into negotiations. The Brexit EU Council summit is next week.
Right.
What's the positive news, Jeffrey?
Barnier said to me, there is a way. Right? So he's standing on his feet saying one thing and giving one impression. He's saying to me, he said, there is a way.
So what is it? What is that?
Know it by now.
We didn't have time to get on to.
So you don't know the way right now, then?
We don't know the way. No. But what I'm saying is, anyone that suggests that Boris Johnson does not want a deal does not understand him. He, of course, wants a deal, right? There's a week to go to get that deal done.
Do the people around him want a deal?
The people around him want a deal. He wants a deal.
Walk out with that one.
We saw yesterday, that's not very apparent, you know. It's almost like we're willing to just leave the whole population of the United Kingdom in limbo, and so many people are asking, what's going to happen to me? What's the impact of the sort of cliff-edge no-deal scenario?
I have to say,
relatives.
European Union is not the be-all and end-all of
I have
our
relatives who live in the United Kingdom, and they are EU citizens, and they are wondering what's going to happen to them, to their family, to their careers.
I know you didn't want to focus.
Not on everything.
I know you didn't want to focus on whether or not he was going to break the law and come here, but that does set a precedent, and all the rhetoric that they're saying that they have now, it's still pointing to that, to the possibility that he might not even come here for an extension. You know,
that's exactly the point. We need to. I think everybody wants to know what's going to happen. I mean, we cannot wait until hours before the deadline.
I just to make it clear, he doesn't need to physically come here to seek an extension. And the big question is there much point in him coming here next week if it is evident that there is not going to be a deal? And in those circumstances, there probably isn't. The most crucial day in the next couple of weeks will probably not be here in Brussels, but will be, as Vincent was talking about, that extraordinary meeting of the House of Commons on October 19th.
And what's the point of an extension, right? We should have left on the 29th of March. Now the 31st of October. What would be the point of an extension? We need to get the deal done.
Well, he's got to. He's got to. Parliament asked him to. So that's what we have to see.
We need to get the deal done in the next week. It is possible. It is possible.
Okay. So there you go. The question still is, will he, won't he? Will there be a deal with or won't? And will Boris Johnson ask for that extension? Well, meanwhile, in the United States, a different constitutional battle is brewing, with the White House refusing to cooperate with the impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump. In a letter sent to Democratic leaders, the White House branded the inquiry, quote, constitutionally invalid in an attempt to overturn the results of the 2016 election. Now, this came shortly after the State Department blocked Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the EU, from testifying to Congress that the investigation is trying to find out whether Trump abused his power by pressuring Ukraine to help investigate his Democratic rival, Joe Biden. So, well, the respect for the rule of law has been a concern in many countries recently. And to talk about this trend, we are now joined by Dr. Joel Grogan, who is a senior lecturer in EU and UK public law at Middlesex University in London. Okay, you know, we talked about two places here, the UK and the US. What is driving this trend of seemingly pitting, you know, a government against its own parliament, against its own judiciary? Is this a trend that's here to stay? And what's driving it?
Well, as an expert in the rule of law, I really hope it's not here to stay. Let's begin with one of the foundations, and this is something everyone can agree on. Anyone who lives in a democracy that is based on the rule of law, it all comes down to one very simple idea, which is that no man, no government, no prime minister, no president is above the law. We can all agree on that. But as part of that, it's the idea of the separation of powers, that we have these institutions. We have the Congress in the US, Parliament here in the UK, and the executive. So that's the president in the US, the prime minister and his cabinet in the UK, and that these have their own powers. And all of these powers should be exercised lawfully. Now, everything that we're discussing in terms of impeachment and also in Brexit, in the Ben Act, this is the big act that you were just discussing, this is all about the exercise of government power and the limits on those exercise of government power. And that...
Yeah, Dr. Grogan, sorry to interrupt you. I just, you know, you're talking about having to follow the rule of law, etc., but then the people still seem to support these leaders who challenge the institutions.
So this is always an incredible question of the people in one vote. But something very important about democracy is that the people are everyone. The people are every single person who votes and votes every time that there's an election, every time that there's a referendum, every time something is called to a vote. Now, something very important also about these democracies is that power of the vote then gives legitimacy, that gives power and authority to the institutions. We vote in Parliament, we vote in Congress, we vote, well, Americans vote into the president, and this is the expression of democratic will. Referendums are incredibly important statements, but they are also a very important part of a larger institutional structure, a respect for these different institutions and the different powers that those institutions have. So when we say the people, often it can have a very politicized meaning, a very exclusionary meaning, that only a specific group of people constitute the real people, and everyone else is not part of it.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Joel Grogan, a senior lecturer there from Middlesex University in London. You know, we're talking about that the trust in institutions and people still supporting challenges to institutions. Is democracy and democratic institutions in danger as we know it? Jeffrey?
Well, this is one of the reasons why we've said we must respect the democratic vote of the British people in a referendum on Brexit, for example. And this is one of the reasons why we've said if that is not respected, then there will be a crisis of democracy.
But then on the other hand,
you can't have it both ways.
Exactly, but on the other hand, you have leaders threatening not to follow.
Not to make this about Brexit, but the current Prime Minister voted twice in Parliament against a deal to leave the European Union. And my point is that, like, a referendum is a binary question. People voted to leave, but clearly there are many different ways of leaving, and that's what people get trouble with. The point about democracy is not simply the will of the people. I mean, look at the US Constitution. Sure. It's not simply about the rule of the mob. It's about a whole, particularly in a representative democracy, it's about whole other types of checks and balances on power. And ultimately, when you then start to get those in conflict with each other, which we see in the United Kingdom and indeed elsewhere, that's when you can get into political trouble.
So does it empower, Roberta, countries that you know, are held in line by countries like the US and the UK, and now they see those countries doing exactly what they were told not to do? Have they lost their moral authority?
Yeah, I think that from a broader perspective, we have seen increasingly governments that run countries and because they won elections think that they can trample over the minority. Now, democracy does not mean that when you win, that means you ignore everybody who disagrees with you. Right. That means that you do not take over the courts. That means that you do not close down media houses. That means that you do not go after minorities. This is something that that we have seen even in the European Union. And yes, admittedly, we have always looked to the United Kingdom and to the US as sort of the beacons of democracy and judicial checks and balances. And sometimes we question. We should, of course. Here we have different opinions on what's happening. But yes, I would expect politicians to be held accountable not only to their voters, but to the whole population.
Okay, all right, we'll leave it at that. Let's move on now and turn to the United Nations, another organization which has felt the wrath of Donald Trump, who might just be turning the screws on the international body. Let's take a look. The United Nations. It rose from the ruins of World War II, a place for the world's great powers to talk. It'll celebrate its 74th birthday this month, but don't expect a party.
The organization is facing a severe financial crisis.
Secretary General Antonio Guterres sounding the alarm.
These months, we will reach the deepest deficit of the decade. We risk exhausting the closed peacekeeping cash reserves and entering November without enough cash to cover payrolls.
So far this year, 129 of the UN's member states have paid their contributions, but 64 are yet to pay up, including the biggest funder of the UN, the United States, which under Donald Trump has been calling for reforms and cost-cutting. Washington says it will pay most of what it owes soon, but in the meantime, belt-tightening looks set to continue at the United Nations. All right, so on topic of what we were talking about, is this another example of undermining, the U.S. undermining an institution there, waiting for the money at the UN?
It clearly is, but, Donald Trump was elected to put America first, and many would question what precisely the United Nations role in the world is today. Is it an effective force, or does it waste a lot of money not really doing very much? And you know what? A lot of people may have sympathy for the latter, that the UN has kind of slightly lost its way.
That was a grabbing headline, that the UN running out of money there. All right, coming up on Raw Politics, a shrinking government. What drove Italian politicians to cut their own jobs? Plus, the power of protest. We look back on the demonstrations that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall 30 years ago. Welcome back to Raw Politics, and we turn to Italy now, where a vote in the lower house yesterday passed with an overwhelming majority, fulfilling a manifesto promise from the governing Five-Star Movement. The scissors are out, and Italian politicians have voted to cut, well, themselves. Moves are now underway to slash the number of parliamentarians in both the lower house and the Senate. According to the Five-Star Movement, 345 politicians are out. It means €1 billion saved. But does Italy have too many politicians? Let's take a look at some numbers. So on the face of it, they have 945, second only to the UK, and paling in comparison to countries like Malta and Luxembourg. So there you're looking at that graph. But when we look at the numbers compared to the population, it is a completely different story. And in terms of representation, Italy fares badly with only 1.6 politicians per 100,000 citizens. And Malta is actually leading Europe with 14.4. Okay, so let's get right into it with politicians from these countries, in fact. So we have Ignacio Corrao, Italian MEP from the Five-Star Movement. Roberta Metsola still with us, a Maltese MEP with the European People's Party. And joining us is Seb Dance, a British MEP from the Socialists and Democrats group. Okay, first, I will ask you again, always with the Italy story. Long-awaited reform is how it's been put. But the savings, I mean, you reacted to that 1 billion in savings. It's negligible if you think about it. What's the real reason for doing this?
Well, let's say that this is a reform that everyone has tried to do, but this is the first time that we managed to achieve the result, because every single legislature in Italy, someone tried but put the reduction of numbers of MEPs inside a bigger reform. And then it was refused either by the parliament or the people.
In the grand scheme of savings, though, is this really a big thing? Or it seems like a drop in the ocean considering Italy's fiscal situation?
Italy is a very big country with big economies, not 1 billion that changed the history of our country. The point is the responsibility of MPs. Having almost 1,000 MPs, many of them have not responsibility with the constituency and with the people. So having a little less means that you have more people that are held responsible to work.
Okay, so you're saying more accountability and maybe efficiency. Before I go to Malta, I'll ask you, Seb, why you were reacting to
No, it was the sum of money sounds huge. actually.
In absolute terms.
Yeah, in absolute terms.
Yeah.
Very well paid.
Yeah. But I mean, it's a difficult one because, of course, each country has a different system. But in the UK, for example, the constituency link is very, very important. And each member of parliament represents anything between 75,000 to 100,000 people. And to reduce the number of MPs, to increase the number of constituents per MP, obviously dilutes that link very substantially. And it's a balance, you know, there is a cost to reducing the number of MPs as well as a benefit.
So if we look at the Maltese example, where it fares well in terms of representation, does this kind of cutting the number of parliamentarians actually endanger representation, proper representation of the population?
First of all, let's start with the financials. In Malta, the parliament is part-time, and unless you're in government and you're a minister, then the amount of money you receive is low in comparison to other countries. But also, going back to what Seb has just said, we have a system of very, very direct democracy, which means that our members of parliament actually knock on doors. They are very well known with their constituents. Constituents feel they have a direct link with the representatives. So suddenly slashing that number would have a direct impact, because even though the numbers are proportionately larger when compared to other countries, the way we elect our politicians means that you're held accountable for every vote you receive, and that means
before I get you to respond, let's
that.
first listen to what Italians have to say. So we asked Italians on the street to get some reaction to this news, and this is what they had to say.
Adesso metteranno dei soldi, però ecco, magari ristruttureranno, faranno strade, ci saranno per la sanità, magari faranno delle infrastrutture.
Su questo spetta a qualcun altro dirlo. Ho dei dubbi su quanto effettivamente si possa risparmiare, però se è quello che vogliono gli italiani, allora...
È una trovata che serve per suggestionare il grosso pubblico, che secondo me non avrà nessuna incidenza se passerà la votazione.
Yes. Yeah, I will let you say what you have to say, but let me ask if the motivation behind this is really fiscal or political, in the sense that you are talking to your base, your voter base.
To understand what does it mean, what this reform does it mean, we have to explain how the Italian representation system works. For example, my region, Sicily, the Parliament of Sicily costs more than the General Assembly of Spain. We have regions, the regional MPs are paid the same money of the national one. We have then provinces, and then we have city municipalities. So it's a very big system of representation. Cutting 345 members of parliament, you're not reducing the democracy space, because actually in Italy, the only one election where you cannot choose your representative is the national one, and are the parties who choose the ones who sit in the parliament. It's a very different system than in the UK, when you have a small constituency and you have a direct relation.
Yeah, you can tell that there's a difference between MPs,
actually,
MPs who are elected directly.
I'm more related with my constituency myself. We are 73 Italians in the European Parliament, because we are elected with preference votes. And in the national election, not. So there is no reduction of the space of democracy. It's a reduction of spending money.
So you're saying that this is really a fiscal move in this sense?
It's
and it was a promise by Prime Minister.
I mean, I would call it like this. It's a way of normalizing the democratic process in Italy, because sometimes things are excessive.
With the democratic process, because
I love that.
Sometimes. Because I also saw there were some concerns about when you have fewer lawmakers, and it's easier to have more control up at the top. Is this a danger that you're seeing in this?
Yeah, I think generally that can be a danger. I accept completely that different countries have different systems, different reforms will work better in some countries more than others, and we can only give our own country's perspective in terms of what we feel about that. But yes, I feel that could obviously be a danger. And in terms of public opinion, of course, when you talk about cutting the number of members of parliament, people will always wave and cheer and go, yeah, we hate them, they're all awful. Because the reality is representative democracy is extremely important. We have to defend it. There are different ways of defending it, but I would think that generally, as a principle, cutting the number of MPs obviously poses risks in terms of scrutiny of the government.
All right, well, there you go. Different view from 3 different European countries on that topic there. Well, coming up on Raw Politics, it looks like a politician, sounds like a politician, but is it a politician? Experts are warning on the rise in deep fakes online. It could cause a real-world political crisis. That's up next. Welcome back. Well, experts are warning that the rise of so-called deep fakes could create a real-world political crisis. Alex and our team in theCUBE have been looking into this.
When it comes to deep fakes, this is a rather interesting example. Have a watch of this.
Today is a historic day. I have tremendous news. Today, we eradicated AIDS. Thank God. Thank you, Donald Trump. It's done. All done,
now, not
folks.
only is that news there fake news, the video, of course, is fake. Now, what's different about this is it's made by a charity who acknowledge that, yes, it's a fake video. On the end, they say, yeah, it's a fake video, but wouldn't it be good if this was the truth? However, some people not so comfortable with the fact that even a progressive charity is using the technology of deep fakes, that is to manipulate audio-visual material, in their campaigns at a time when, of course, we've seen a real rise in this kind of content, particularly in the United States. Let's bring you what some people are saying. Lucas here saying that it's unsettling that he's saying here. It's a bad strategy, dubious, he says, that people should be using this, that even charities should stay away from using this kind of technology. Now, why does this matter? It might just look like an isolated example. Well, in the United States, a video went viral. It showed Nancy Pelosi of the Democrats seemingly slurring. The video was manipulated. It was a deep fake, but it got a lot of traction. This technology is quite clearly growing, and a lot of people are seeing more and more of it. Some people saying that actually we should all be staying away from it on social media. A really interesting report came out just last month, which said that in terms of deep fakes, the last 7 to 8 months seeing a real rise. This year, seeing a real development of this technology. I spoke to one of the researchers from Cambridge in the UK. I started by asking, what could the political implications be of videos like this if they were to, say, not be done by a charity, but by bad actors? This is what they had to say to me.
Deepfakes in the political sphere are having this impact of destabilizing trust in audiovisual media, even if that media is authentic. So in the immediate term, what I envision is not necessarily a huge amount of deepfakes being used to entirely disable political processes, but the kind of growing suspicion and skepticism about the authenticity of audiovisual media, destabilizing discourse and making real images or videos susceptible to being claimed to be deepfakes.
So what can we do? Well, we don't like to leave you without a solution here. So the next question I asked was, what can we do? What are the giveaway signs? This is what Henry from that research had to say to me.
It's important to note that at the moment it's dangerous to say there are specific signs that people can look for because the technology is evolving so fast. So we believe that, there are multiple solution approaches that are required. Detection is one of them. Increased educational awareness, both by state actors and as an individual's responsibility. And also there is some space for legislative and legal responses too.
And that last point there by Henry Ada, something European politicians will have to think about, especially as the European Union launching and putting together this disinformation brief that they are now looking at. But once again, we're seeing, whether it's by a charity or a bad actor, deep fake technology making the headlines once again, doing the rounds on social media.
All right, thanks to our CUBE team for that. And with us to talk about this is Eva Kaili, a Greek MEP with the Socialists and Democrats group. We have Marketa Gregorova, a Czech MEP with the Greens European Free Alliance group. And back with us, Darren McCaffrey, our political editor. When we look at those videos, Eva, I'll talk to you. You look at the technology files here at the European Parliament. How prevalent and is this now in the European Union? How dangerous is it?
Well, actually, it could cause political crisis if you cannot understand, you cannot tell before it becomes viral that it is a deep fake, and developers already have problems to understand if something is synthetic or not. This could be too obvious, but there are some videos that are actually close to perfection. So what we have done already, though, in January, in my report of artificial intelligence with some other colleagues, was to make sure that companies and developers should state clearly that it's a deep fake, because the manipulation of perception can happen in many ways, not just deep fakes and synthetic videos. And we have to make sure that they will pay high penalties to avoid doing that, because it could happen really fast, cause a big political crisis. Imagine if it happens before elections.
How do you implement that? Yeah, exactly. So how do you implement that, though? How do you get them to declare that it is a deep fake if the intention is not good there?
That's true. So besides the high penalties, what we can do and what, for example, Google is doing is releasing a lot of data sets so that developers can have examples of deepfakes, and this could help them to identify immediately if they are deepfakes. We have blockchain, you can timestamp the videos or authenticate the source and make sure that we will have a verification process taking place before something can be used to affect elections.
So that is what the EU is doing, but there is something new that just passed in California. So they passed a law banning political deepfakes being circulated during election season. What they defined it as is it's false or damaging impressions of a politician's words or actions. So there's that law, but then there are others who are saying, well, this is going to, impede on freedom of speech. It could be a repression of speech while the intentions are good. What do you think? Is a ban, because as Eva was saying, we're doing this in the EU, but is a ban necessary during election season especially?
Absolutely not. The contrary, well, when this is part of disinformation, and you actually need to fight disinformation with free access to information. Otherwise, what can happen is that there will be established something like the Ministry of Truth, like Orwell wrote about.
But it's not
and
just
we don't
saying
want
one
that.
thing and meaning, and it's not about it just interpretation. It's actually manipulating something to
well,
be
but
what
it's
it
already
isn't, right?
it's the same as when you Photoshop, I don't know, text next to my picture. There could be my picture, text to it. I want to, I don't know, I support Erdogan, which I, by the way, don't. And who will know if it's true or not? And deepfake is pretty much the same, just more sophisticated. So what we need actually to do is not bans, because then we could pretty much ban everything, because that's the human nature, to do this. What we need to do is educate citizens, and of course apply such technological measures as Eva talked about, to be able to distinguish it, but also educate citizens so that they can recognize and work with the information critically.
I think the issue that would take time, and what we have is we're facing the issue now. Like, this is already happening faster than maybe we could adapt to it.
That's certainly true, and the fear about this is not simply that people lose trust in what is fake, but also in what is true as well, because clearly what we've seen with the disinformation campaign is that you can call out truths as fakes as much as fakes as truths.
Exactly.
But that's where I think there's actually a role for us in the media in all of this, because ultimately, actually, it might be a good test and a kind of evaluation of big brands, trusted news organisations, who, like our colleagues actually in the Cube, who are able to go through and essentially demonstrate whether something is true or not, whether something is a deep fake or not. And I think actually there is not just a responsibility and an obligation, but potentially even an opportunity for news organisations to kind of prove that
there's space for that.
Well, to prove what is true and to be trusted when they say it is true.
Very quickly before we go, Eva, is what is being done enough to catch up with the speed of the developments in deepfake by the EU?
Actually, we have to do more, and we're planning to do so. The new president-elect will say that in 100 days we have to have law on artificial intelligence. I'm not pro-filtering content, because then, you can already mix a real video to be fake, and this is where the problem starts. So I would say we definitely need verified sources. We need to educate media, and we need to have some timestamping and find other ways to deal with it, because this is just the beginning of exceptional technologies coming
we're already
to our
seeing
lives,
it and
changing our perceptions.
Some deepfakes can be fun. Can we at least make that point as well?
That's true. It's true. It can be entertaining.
It is also fun and technology.
Last word to Marketa before we go on this topic.
Oh, on this topic, well, I can't really agree with you saying, that, well, it's happening now, so we can't focus on the long term.
No, we can, but
we actually have to focus on the long term, because we already overslept, because we are still focusing just on the present and never on the future, which is, by the way, mostly the problem of most politicians. They're focusing only on their election term and only what they can do in their 4 or 5 years, and not on actually the future.
So we have to start
doing that
early, and rather than just playing catch up. All right. Well, coming up on Raw Politics, uncooperative crusties, Boris Johnson's message to Extinction Rebellion protesters, plus the group's most eye-catching moments in tonight's Raw Moment. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, 30 years ago, events in a small East German town would change the course of Europe's history. Let's take a look. We are the people, they chanted, as darkness fell on the 9th of November, 1989. a turning point in the history of Germany and Europe. It began in the East German city of Leipzig, where between 70 and 100,000 people took to the streets, a peaceful protest against the governing communist regime, which quickly spread beyond the town. Despite fears of a Tiananmen Square-style response from security forces, they just watched. Watched on as the people of East Germany sparked a movement which, exactly 1 month later, would lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and the unification of Germany. Well, with us in the studio to look at this, still here, Eva Kaili, a Greek MEP with the Socialists and Democrats group, and back with us, Seb Dance, a British MEP with the Socialists and Democrats group as well, and Darren is still with us. So when we look at that, I mean, Europe has come a long way, and we see there also the power of protest, just to point that out.
It's one of my earliest memories, actually, and I feel quite emotional when I see the pictures again, because there are people who have lived under a regime that suppressed any kind of political expression, any kind of free speech, going onto the street, demanding freedoms, and who could have known the butterfly effect that would have had. And that's really when the Second World War ended. It ended in November 1989.
Right, and when you look at those images, Eva, what goes through your mind?
That it's madness, it was madness, this division, and some things that we take for granted now, like peace and democracy in the European Union, they just happened a few decades ago. So I think we have to appreciate them, and it's always good to remember what happened in Europe.
Is that the case now that we're taking democracy for granted, you think?
I mean, to a little bit, to a degree. It is quite extraordinary when you think about how much of Europe, or the modern-day European Union, was essentially not democratic not that long ago. We talk about rule of law issues in certain countries, and they are serious issues, but they're a hell of a long way away from where they were 30 years ago. That is not to say, though, that you look particularly at Germany, that in many ways that East-West divide is actually getting worse. I mean, it is clear that East Germans think, they vote, and they see themselves in a very different way from West Germans today. And far from actually unification in some ways having worked, and it has worked largely, but we're starting to see a little bit of unravelling on that. And that, I think, should concern Europe's biggest country.
All right, well, for 30 years on from the peaceful protests that you just saw in East Germany, peaceful protesters are out in force on the streets of London. Well, this time in the name of climate. That's in tonight's From Moment.
My own team didn't want me to come to this event tonight because they said that there were some uncooperative crusties and protesters of all kinds littering the road.
At this time of their marriage, they give themselves to one another.
We saw lots of creative costumes at that protest. And just to note that Boris Johnson did change his tune because he called them uncooperative crusties. But he said now they are wonderful climate change activists who have been making a lot of noise with the haunting, lilting melody of the saxophone wafting in over the Downing Street walls.
Johnson in U-turn shock.
There you go. Well, if we look at this, we were talking about protests and how it changed history. Do you think this is a turning point when we talk about climate change and it will change the course of how we do things now in the future?
I hope so. It's irritating that it's come to civil disobedience to get this issue kind of raised up the stakes. But I think there is a general public awareness that there wasn't not that long ago. And it's across the board. It's not just young people, it's middle-class professionals. And I think there was a 91-year-old protester who was arrested earlier. I mean, you know, good on him. It's not his future he's protesting about. It's the future of the planet, and he cares enough to get out on the streets.
And as we know, protesters say they will keep
I think undoubtedly, while it's true that far more people are aware of green issues and it's a big political issue, I mean, this is not an uprising. I mean, these are tens of thousands of people, not millions.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it at that for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us on Raw Politics, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Bye for now.